Hello everyone, thanks so much for joining us today for this Fab and Ofqual webinar for AOs on developing your approach to calculated results. I'm really pleased that Zeke Swery and Steve Holmes from Ofqual are presenting for us today. They've got a number of slides, but we are expecting there'll be a lot of time at the end available for questions. So Steve and Zeke will answer any questions they can now, and we'll get any that need to be taken away back to you as soon as possible. I don't think I actually said who I was. So I'm Dr. Rebecca Conway, the head of policy and strategy for the Federation of Awarding Bodies. So everybody's on mute because this is a very large meeting. We're expecting about 160 on the line today. So if you do want to contribute, and please do get your questions in, if you could use the question icon, the question function, sorry, on GoToWebinar. So if you're on a computer, that's in the sidebar. And if you're on a tablet, it's like a little icon. So please do get your questions in. And I'm now going to hand over to Zeke and Steve.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Zeke Swery from Ofqual, and Steve Holmes is also going to be speaking. But just to sort of reiterate the purpose of this, really, we want to be able to support your thinking on the approaches that you might take to generating calculated results, including QAing and also final checks on outcomes. And we've tried to design this to be as user-friendly and as practical as possible. So we're not assuming any sort of background in any sort of complex statistics or anything of that nature. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So there's just a few things to reiterate first that you may be partly familiar with, because you may have seen if you've looked at the consultation documents that are online on the Ofqual website. The first thing is really about the key principles that should be guiding this process, which aren't that different to GQ principles in reality. We're trying to provide learners with the grades they would have most likely achieved had they been able to take their assessments in summer 2020. We're trying to enable the maximum number of learners to receive grades, but provided, of course, that those grades are sufficiently valid and sufficiently reliable. There's also 3 other points there about protecting learners or groups of learners from being systematically advantaged or disadvantaged, for methods to be sufficiently transparent and easy to explain, and for this ought to be deliverable with sufficient oversight from Ofqual. In striving to meet these principles, we of course realize that there are going to be compromises that will need to be made. For example, in relation to principle 2 above about getting the maximum number of learners to achieve grades, because of that need to have sufficient validity and reliability, that there are going to be some learners for whom the evidence that we have falls below a minimum evidential threshold, which is something we'll talk about later, and therefore no grades can be provided. Obviously, we're trying to minimize the extent as far as possible to which that happens by seeing how much we can make use of the evidence that we have at hand. And that's really what this is about today, is thinking about what evidence there is and how we can use it to generate calculated results. Okay, next slide, thanks. So the next point to make is that there is simply no single approach that is going to work for all qualifications. The vocational and technical qualifications that are likely to use a calculated approach are varied in a number of respects, and many of those are listed on this slide. Learners likely to have very different profiles of formal assessment already completed, and the types of and extent of evidence available to you is going to vary significantly. And next slide again, thanks. And similarly, the other point to make is that it is not possible to provide absolute rules in any of this, because each context is going to be different. So, for example, one of the possibilities that that's been frequently discussed over the last few weeks is the idea of providing fixed tolerances in terms of the level of acceptable change in outcomes that we might see from previous years. But the problem here is that different qualifications might show different levels of variation year on year. And so your own historic data is a more appropriate guide, and any fixed tolerances that we provide are going to be limited in their applicability when we start looking across different qualifications. There's also other aspects such as the size of the centre that we'll talk about for a minute, the size of the entry, and the same tolerance cannot really be used to work in centres of different sizes. So ultimately, the approach that we take has to be sufficiently flexible to acknowledge the massive variations in these qualifications and allow you to devise and implement approaches to calculate grades which are appropriate for your own contexts. And at the same time, though, having a shared understanding of possible approaches and situations under which approaches may be taken will hopefully help in terms of consistency of approach. Thanks. Next slide. So what you see on this slide are really the three high-level steps that you should be thinking about in taking when developing an approach. And the first is to identify the available evidence, and also evidence that can be collected in respect of each qualification. Then to consider the level of trust in each of these different sources of evidence, to evaluate that level of trust. And third is to then devise an approach which maximizes the use of the most trusted evidence. Again, these are the sorts of things that we're going to be thinking about over the next few slides. Thanks. Next slide again. Sorry, can you go to the slide after that? Thank you. That's what I wanted to see. So there are 6 categories of evidence. Again, this is information that you can find more detail on in the consultation document and other documentation on the Ofqual website. The first 3 of these, in one sense, represent 3 levels of trustworthiness of actual grades. So category 1, there are banked components. So here we're talking about internal assessment that has already been moderated and verified, or external assessment grades. And in these cases, it's not surprising that we would consider these to be the most trustworthy sources of evidence where they're available, and we would put a high level of trust in them. The second category relates to internal assessment grades that have already been assigned, but they haven't yet been moderated. And here your level of trust in the data might be informed by historic data on centre judgments. And the third, and one we'll be concentrating quite a lot on the next few slides, are centre assessment grades that we are now asking for where there were no initial grades, and rather teachers have been asked to provide judgments about each of the candidates that was due to take the relevant assessment this year. We can also get additional information at the same time, such as rank ordering, where this is going to be helpful. In terms of trust in that that category of evidence, that's one of the key things we'll be talking about now. And we're thinking about things like the teacher cohort experience and how long the qualification's going for, and so on. Now, the last 3 categories of evidence here really refer to the sorts of data that you might have available to support the process. So the first really relates to historical data about qualification functioning. So, for example, You might have data that shows the extent to which different elements of the qualification actually correlate, where the extent to which performance in units, for example, are within a qualification are consistent. And you might also have historical data on stability at the level of individual centres. The next category relates to historical centre data. So we're thinking about things here like centre risk profiles and centre outcomes. And finally, where useful, there is the possibility of trying to access prior attainment data. There is obviously a big question about the extent to which this data might be predictive of outcomes in your particular qualifications. Thanks. Next slide. And now I'll pass you over to Steve, who's going to be talking through the next few slides.
Indeed, yes. So you've got all these different sources of evidence, and they will fit into various parts of this whole process. We've put forward this three-element idea that there are three parts of the whole process of generating all of the final outcomes. So the initial source of data will be either centre assessment grades or marks or grades that you yourself have calculated. So for each candidate, you've got some kind of calculation. At the level of each centre, you will want to do some kind of quality assurance that those outcomes within that centre look reasonable. And then once you have assessed all of your centres and possibly gone through a process of QAing that data, you need to put all of your outcomes together at the national sort of cohort level and check that these look reasonable. And this might involve going round some of these stages a few times to sort of refine the final outcomes. So the approach that you adopt will depend upon those sorts of evidence that just went through, what's available, how much trust you have in the different sources of evidence. That will help you decide whether you're looking at getting centres to provide calculated grades or marks even, or whether you yourself do it internally based on your own data. Throughout all of this, the underpinning idea will be, has the evidence passed the minimum evidential threshold? So we've kind of stated that there needs to be at least one source of evidence you trust quite highly, and there should be some way to QA the centre outcomes and the overall cohort outcome that's quite robust and gives you confidence that the outcomes you generate are valid and a fair representation of what all of these candidates would have achieved had they sat their actual assessments. So some kind of calculation of grades or marks, depending on your qualification structure, some kind of quality assurance at centre level, and then an overall QA of your final outcomes. Next slide, please. So that process of generating the candidate level grades or marks can obviously be approached in two ways. We've already kind of discussed this. You've got the idea of centres providing a list of grades or doing your own calculation. For your own sort of internally calculated marks or grades, there might be less of the centre level check. It may be that by calculating all of your grades, that when you look at your overall cohort, the data looks quite similar to last year, and therefore there might not be quite such a need to be checking individual centres, given that you would not be relying on any information from the centres. So the choice between those two, and it is not actually a binary choice. There may be instances where you might, for example, ask centres to provide centre assessed grades. You may also do your own calculation based on banked data to QA those centre assessed grades. There may also be a mixed approach within a qualification, that when you've got different units with a different relationship to one another and different sources of evidence, you may want to split the qualification and make certain unit predictions in some ways, like collecting centre assessed grades, whereas other units you may want to calculate yourself. And that choice just comes down to your judgment of confidence in the sources of evidence. And to a certain extent, of course, there are all of those structural questions around the qualification and the way the final grade is calculated. You need to get the right information to make your final outcome. So the way we're going to go with the rest of this presentation is Zeke will talk you through the process of asking for centre assessed grades, and then I'll step in and talk a bit about the calculation of grades from your own data. So I'll hand back to Zeke now and move on to the next slide.
Thanks, Steve. So just to reiterate here, what we're talking about here is where centres provide grades for each learner by determining what grade they judge each learner would have achieved if they'd been able to take their assessment this summer. In doing that, centres are, have a number of sort of responsibilities and requirements that are, as part of this process, and also it's crucial that they understand exactly what they're being asked to do, and a lot of the documentation online on the Ofqual website is to that end. One of the key points is there on that slide, which is that to assume that any reasonable adjustments that would have been sought for a learner when taking their assessments would have been in place. So they are in effect reflected in the grades that are supplied by centres. Okay, next slide, thanks. So how can we quality assure centre assessment grade data, and how can we determine our level of trust in it? The main approach to quality assurance where this is possible is likely to be comparing the profile of centre assessed grades for a centre with the profile for the same period last year or in previous years for that centre. So the idea here is quite simple, that the histogram you see on the slide here shows a made-up profile for one centre, shows the proportion of candidates, percentage of candidates that achieve the 4 different outcomes for this unit or qualification. So we've got proportions for fail, pass, merit, and distinction. And the premise here is that the profile, an equivalent profile for last year for the same period, or for going back further than last year for recent previous years, should be largely the same. Should be similar. And what you're doing here is simply comparing the profiles to see the extent of variability between them. Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. Thanks. Clearly, there are a number of caveats and extra things to think about when you're doing this. The first one is that variation is going to differ. The extent of variation is going to differ depending on the size of the centre, depending on the centre entry. And that second bullet point there kind of sums up quite well in a sense that, for example, if you were to see a pass rate change of 40% to 70%, which might seem like a huge change in proportion of candidates passing, the implications are quite different if you only have 10 candidates, in which case the actual pass rate has gone up from 4 candidates to 7, or if you had 500 candidates, in which case we're talking about a change in the number of candidates passing from 200 to 350. So this is one of the reasons, as we said before, that it's just simply not appropriate to determine and have a fixed or set tolerance level, because there are too many variations, both depending on the nature of the qualification, but also depending on the individual properties of the centre, like the size of the centre entry size. The aim, obviously, here is for us to see as little variation as possible, so that we can be more confident that standards have been maintained. Thanks. Next slide, please. The other factor that might be central to any judgment regarding whether levels of variation are acceptable are centre risk profiles. So the table that you see here is simply a way of thinking about both centre entry size and risk rating when judging the appropriateness of variation in grades. So essentially, it's simply a 2x2 grid showing 4 possible situations in relation to the size of the centre entry and also their risk rating. So, for example, we could have a small centre entry size and low risk rating, and so on. Now, each one of those cells, those 4 cells, has different potential implications in terms of any, if you like, concern we might have where we see high variation in centre performance from one year to the next in that centre profile. So the biggest red flag would be in that bottom right cell. If we have a high centre risk rating and a high centre entry size, and yet we're seeing high levels of variation, then that might be, you know, where most attention needs to go on looking at exactly what's going on. And ultimately, in situations like that, it may be necessary to challenge centres to provide additional information to support their judgments. At the other end of the scale is that the top left cell, where we have a low centre risk rating and a small entry size, and therefore there isn't really enough data given the size of the entry to judge the potential appropriateness of any variation. There's 2 other potentially useful indicators to think about when considering the appropriateness of year-on-year variation. One of them is the extent of variation seen in previous years. So in other words, within a single centre or for the cohort as a whole, how much variation is there. And the other is the extent of variation specifically in low-risk centres. These can provide useful guides, comparators. Thanks a lot. Next slide, please. One of the biggest challenges is going to come where we have new centres or new qualifications, and therefore we lack historic data. For new qualifications, there might be a previous version of that same qualification or a closely related qualification that again might still provide some useful information as a guide. And for new centres, it might be necessary to use profiles from the whole cohort, or where these may exist, we might have comparable centres or sets of comparable centres that we can use within the whole cohort that might be be more representative of what we expect the outcomes to be from that particular centre. Next slide. So one of the key things clearly in all this is the quality of evidence that we're getting from the centre. Again, this goes back to guidance that's on the Ofqual website that centres should be given, but it's worth reiterating it here as well in this webinar, is that learners' results should only be estimated by teachers with direct experience of teaching that learner the subject and component for which the result is being estimated. The second is that for each learner, the teacher, and Steve's already said this, you should consider at least one piece of valid evidence that demonstrates the learner's progress towards the assessment requirements of the component. And the third there is that the quality of evidence from a centre might be indicated by the extent to which the centre assessment typically requires moderation. There's a document that's recently been released online on Ofqual's website. I think it was last Friday, entitled Additional Information for Heads of Centre, Heads of Department and Teachers on Objectivity in Grading and Ranking. And that provides some quite useful and important information in relation to the sorts of biases that people assigning centre assessment grades might be susceptible to when they're carrying that out. In some cases, there may be, where there's otherwise insufficient evidence, it may be necessary to ask to see student work from a centre yourselves. Obviously, we're aware of the manageability issues in doing that, and so it might be that it's only in very particular circumstances that is necessary. Next slide, thanks. It may, in some situations, also be of value to ask centres to provide a rank ordering of their pupils in addition to their grades. This is unlikely to be necessary in all situations and will probably suit some contexts more than others. It might suit contexts more in mark-based qualifications where adjustments can be made more easily. When this information is asked for, it's very important to be clear to the centre about exactly what is being asked for, and you know, including to some fairly obvious points, like the fact that if we're asking for a rank order, what one means in the rank order. You know, one should mean the top candidate, to the top learner. You can imagine the implications of just simple variations in the way that centres understand what they're being asked to do, and that would be obviously a fairly substantial issue if there are different understandings in terms of what a rank of one means in some centres compared to others. And next slide, please. Thanks. Finally, the last thing to talk about for me here is on an overall check on outcomes. And there's just a few points to make here. The first is that previous years comparison should be made on a similar time frame in the year, so that outcomes, because otherwise outcomes may vary at different points in the year, and you wouldn't be therefore getting a fair reflection of what you would expect to see. While some variation at centre level may be acceptable, we would expect to see less variation at national cohort level, assuming adequate entry numbers for the whole qualification. And we would also not normally expect to see large increases in entry. So if that's the case, you'd want to know why that was happening. If there are greater than expected variations in overall outcomes, it might be worth focusing queries particularly on larger high-risk centres, or comparing the profiles of larger high-risk centres with larger low-risk centres to see what might be appropriate, what extent, what levels of variation might be appropriate, and which are more likely to be down to issues to do with particular centres. Okay, thanks a lot. Next slide, and I'm going to pass you back to Steve.
Okay then, thanks, Ike. So I'll talk through the issue of doing your own calculations in a kind of non-technical way. I'm not going to try and teach any particular process. You're in a way best placed to know what is appropriate for your own data and qualifications. So you can either, depending on the way the aggregation of results occurs within the qualification, it may be a case of calculating unit grades, or it may be a case of calculating marks and then combining those marks in some way. So first of all, I'll talk about the scenario where you're just working with grades and combining the grades across the qualification to get the final qualification outcome. So you would basically be looking at trying to calculate some kind of mapping for each combination of banked results. What is the most likely outcome for a missing unit? So in the table shown on there, I've kind of imagined a situation with a 3-unit qualification where perhaps the first 2 units have been banked for a lot of candidates, the final unit is missing, and the table just lists the most likely outcome for that final unit for several different combinations of banked grades. So it's all, it's just a case of working through your combinations and working out what is most likely to occur. However, you just need to bear in mind that you might find illogical kind of almost ranking of the calculated grade in cases where you have an unusual combination for the banked grades. So on that final line, I've kind of moved, unfortunately, to a 4-component 4-unit qualification. But you can imagine a scenario where one candidate in the past has obtained a profile of distinction, and pass for the first 3 units, and then happened to fail the final unit. Now, that would be probably an unhelpful kind of prediction pattern to incorporate into your matrix, given that it would only be based on like a small number of candidates. So you would probably want to do some kind of logic check that your mapping makes some sense. Okay, next slide, please. So, if you're working with marks, things do become a little bit more, potentially more complicated. Not necessarily so, but if you are calculating a mark for each of your units and then combining them in some way, depending on the number of units you have and the relationship between those units, different statistical or at least numerical approaches might be required. You are probably best placed to make that decision on using your knowledge of the data that you collect and the way you combine. I've put down a couple of scenarios that range from a very simple model, which perhaps doesn't normally occur, to a more complex one. So you can imagine, say you have a 4-unit qualification, all of those 4 units share a similar relationship. I'll talk about relationships in the following slides, but they all have a similar relationship. They all predict the results on each other in a similar way, and therefore it's almost the case that if you have you might take the decision that you would want to have 2 banked units out of the 4. That might be a scenario that below that you wouldn't have confidence in predicting or calculating, but if you've got 2 of the 4 units, you might decide that you can calculate estimated marks for the other 2 units. And it might be because all of the units have a very similar profile, each candidate perhaps scores very similar marks on all 4 units from your historic data, that you can just basically scale up the marks you already have and map those to your normal grade boundaries. Now that's a very, very perfect scenario, which I realise won't probably arise that often, but let's just put it up there as best case scenario. If you have multiple unit qualification and those units have quite a complex relationship, the prediction of marks from one unit may be good for another unit, but quite weak for a second unbanked unit. But there you may want to apply models like multiple linear regression. I'm not going to talk about these. Other than to note that they exist. You should, if you use these typically, then and this might be in a kind of aggregat scenario. I'll touch on that later on, but probably best to stick to what you know. That's at the more complex end of the spectrum. So we'll move on to a few examples. Next slide, please. So the fundamental data here in doing any kind of calculation based on data you hold is just knowing the relationship between performance on different units. Now, there might be a tendency to think that you need to be doing something extremely clever and advanced. However, I'd like to suggest that at a first stage, at a simple level, you may just be able to use Excel to calculate correlations between units in your historic data. I'll show you on the next slide, which we won't go to yet, but the next slide will sort of have some examples. Oh, go back. Sorry. For correlations between units, sort of, it's not a hard and fast rule. Typically, if you've got correlations below 0.5, you might be a little hesitant about those. Correlations above 0.5 are generally reasonably robust to make calculations from. Obviously, if you have several units banked and you're trying to calculate a mark for one missing unit based on several units, then individual correlations less than 0.5 may be okay because you've got several sources of evidence you're combining. There's also the point that by doing this analysis just at pairs of units, so working out what the correlation between all the different pairs of units might be in a qualification, you can see whether some are more diagnostic than others. And you may take a sort of split approach in terms of predicting marks on missing units. We can, and when we move in a minute onto the next slide, I'll show you what a linear regression looks like and how you can use that to calculate marks on one unit from a unit you already have banked. Just to note that some AOs are doing very sort of advanced stuff with their mark data. They might be converting them into Z-scores. We're not suggesting that anyone needs to suddenly plunge to the very most complicated scenario. You kind of almost need to carry on doing what you would normally do in a situation where you might need to predict, calculate a missing unit for a candidate who, for good reason, has not been able to complete the qualification. So largely stick to what you know, I think. If we move on to the next slide, we'll look at Excel. So this is just to reassure you that if you're small and you don't have a dedicated sort of data analysis team, and you therefore possibly don't have access to statistical software like SPSS or R or anything like that, you can do some of these analyses just in Excel. Just bung in, like here, we've got 2 columns of unit data on the left. This is sort of made up historic unit data. And having 2 columns of data like that, you can just run a correlation in Excel. I picked 2 units that are kind of like an extreme case in a way, that these 2 are very highly related to one another. This level of correlation circled with the red oval would probably be atypical. That level of high correlation you'd be expecting probably in most cases to see quite a bit lower. But just to show you that it's just a simple command in Excel, gives you a correlation. That is quite useful for working out what you want to do, how your units relate to one another, and whether you feel confident to make calculations for one unit based on a prior unit. So this is just to reiterate, this is what your historic data tells you. And what you might want to do is to sort of go, well, okay, I've got unit 1 banked by a load of candidates, but they haven't done unit 2. How do I calculate unit 2 if I know their unit 1 marks? So the actual plot, the scatter plot on the right, shows how you'd fit a linear regression. This is actually just I think it's down as a trend line in Excel. The linear regression just represents the relationship between all of those points. At the top is an equation that top row actually allows you to plug numbers in and calculate. So if we want to know what someone who's achieved 30 marks on unit 1, what would we expect them to achieve on unit 2? You can literally plug that 30 into that y equation at the top, multiply the 30 by 0.87 da-di-da, and add 2.49 to it, and you'll get a number somewhere around 28. So you're basically looking to define that relationship with a linear regression. Hopefully that's sort of not too, well, probably for many of you that's rather basic, but I think it's just worth saying and showing that it's not, you don't need sort of advanced stats skills to do some of these simple analyses. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So some of these are probably things that we've said before, but worth reiterating. There's this issue that the relationship between units may be complex, and one unit may assess a very different construct. You can imagine a situation where you might have an internally assessed unit and 3 externally assessed, or vice versa, possibly assessing different constructs of the whole assessment construct. And you just need to be careful in what you're using to calculate missing units. And that means that you may want to mix the approach, so a mixture of calculation from your own data and centre assessed grades for others. If it feels as though those centre assessed grades are the safest, most secure way to obtain grade judgment for a candidate. So I've mentioned Agritat a couple of times. Hopefully a lot of you will have a process for when a candidate can't take a unit, and this will often be a good guide as to how in these circumstances you might want to do some kind of calculation. There's also the issue of prior attainment. I'm sure that several of you have probably sort of wondered about this. Obviously in the world of GQ, the prior attainment of candidates is used to sort of control outcomes to a certain extent. However, it's worth noting that even there, where the relationship between, if we take GCSE, the relationship between Key Stage 2 results and GCSE is not a hugely strong, it's not a correlation of 0.95 or anything like that. and that prior attainment data is not used at individual candidate level. It will be used to sort of control whole centre outcomes. So particularly in the world of vocational qualifications, the relationship between these kind of prior attainment measures and qualification outcomes can actually be quite low. The correlations may be too low to have any confidence in. And so for many of you, there will be a concern about, are we expected to use prior attainment to do some kind of cunning calculation? Probably not, unless you already routinely use it in some way. The effort of trying to obtain that kind of data, and there are sort of, obviously it's not straightforward to obtain some of that prior attainment data, may have limited value. And so I think it's sort of, don't worry too much about that. If you're an AO that has access to that kind of data, obviously, and you normally use it, don't stop using it. Okay, next slide, please. Right, okay, so if we say you've calculated from banked unit data a load of either grades for individual candidates or marks, depending on how you normally work and combine units. For the distribution of grades, the comparison to last year to make sure that you don't have some distortion in your calculation would be very similar to that covered by the slides on centre assessed grades. You would just be looking to sort of histogram them and work out whether your proportion of passes, merits, whatever grading scale you have, hasn't changed greatly. Again, using your own pass data, that final bullet point on this slide, patterns year by year will give you the best idea as to what is a reasonable degree of change. So if you look at a window in 2017, compare that to 2018, then do 2018 to 2019, you'll get a kind of sense as to what is typically what the changes might look like. And therefore you would just do the same kind of check on your overall cohort estimates or calculations, just to check that they look reasonable and that something hasn't gone awry. If you're working with marks, then you'll obviously be thinking about the famous bell curve or normal distribution. In general, marks on components should follow some kind of normal distribution. Shown there is a perfect distribution. Obviously, that isn't ideal, and depending on your entry numbers and the particular sort of design of the assessment, you might not see that kind of pattern. However, what you don't want to see are big changes in that distribution. So if you look at last year's data and compare it to your calculated marks, we don't want to, you ideally wouldn't want to see huge changes. If you go on to the next slide, I'll show you what kind of things we're talking about. So next slide, that's the one. So here's some sort of mocked up distributions. We've got a unit with 50 marks in this case. On the left-hand side is a distribution. So this isn't actually, you might be looking at the y-axis, the vertical axis, wondering why it says density. So these are actually probabilities of getting each individual mark rather than counts. It doesn't really change anything. It's the same visualization effectively. But you can see that the most likely score on this unit last year was 25, and there's a kind of fairly symmetric bell curve of marks on this unit. On the right hand side, we've got two different scenarios for if you've calculated a load of marks for candidates and you see either one of these two, you might think, is this okay? So we're looking for shifts in the mean. You can see the top right graph has dropped down more to sort of 17, 18 range from 25 last year, and the lower right has jumped up to sort of 30 through 32-ish. Concurrent with a change in a shift in the mean, you may also see shifts in the width of the distribution. So particularly look at the bottom right one, where there's been a little bit of compression of the mark, so the distribution is less broad. That can have consequences for sort of differentiation between grades. And the final thing to note is skew. Skew refers to the distribution of marks changing in how symmetric it is. So that bottom right graph has a slight tail at the lower marks because it's shifted upwards. You end up with this skew of a long tail on the left, and we've got to be honest about this. The lower right scenario is perhaps more likely than the upper right. Not so much in your own calculations, but remember, these kind of checks are also going to be valid in the situation where a centre provides you with mark estimates or some fine-grained detail which maps to points or something on the qualification. And so where the centres are making these estimates, you can do the same kind of analysis, and you might, well, not expect, but it is possible that we may see some degree of inflation, which would be that lower right figure. Okay, next slide, please. So these are slightly outside of the sort of general stuff we've been talking about, wider, broader considerations. Some of you might be concerned about mid-flight candidates. So those who would have been finishing year one for a 2-year qualification. Now, there are several ways that you can approach that. To a certain extent, that might depend on whether you've got nested qualifications, so where a learner might have had the ability to certificate in a smaller certificate, for example, at the end of year one. You might feel more inclined and more necessary to collect estimates from the centre now in order that you can award unit grades at this point in time. Another approach, which may be more feasible if you don't have a nested qualification, so all of the learners would have been expected to carry on to the end of their second year, is to actually wait until next year, next summer, let them sit the units they would have sat in that second year, and then use that extremely high validity, high robustness data to support back calculation of units they might have taken or would have been expected to take this summer. Another alternative, which possibly might have implications for pressure on teaching time, and centres may have something to say about that, might be to delay just taking these year one assessments until things potentially return to normal next school year. That would work, but may have consequences for teaching time. So an even broader issue perhaps is you might be looking at all of this and sort of going, well, yeah, I'm not entirely sure whether we or centres have robust enough evidence to make the calculation. So it's worth acknowledging that we have stated that there may be a need to adapt assessments, or even potentially in the worst scenario, delay them. We're not going to go into that in any detail. I think that future webinars might well cover this, and of course future announcements from us are likely to address this in a lot more detail. So next slide, please. So the minimum evidential threshold, in a way, I might be disappointing you, because it's very hard for us to say what is a clear hurdle, so some clear definition of what the minimum evidential threshold is. There are just too many complications in scenarios. Everyone's in a different boat, qualifications are all different. So that is something best determined by you as AOs in the particular context you're working in. This is again going back to the idea that you have to have confidence that learners are getting what they would have achieved. They're being awarded a calculated grade that is a fair, robust reflection of what they would have achieved if they'd set the qualification. So the best guidance we can give at the moment is that providing calculated results needs to be based on at least one source of trusted evidence. Alongside that, you have to have some robust way of quality assuring. Particularly, this refers to centre assessed grades. You may determine that there's insufficient evidence to safely calculate a result. So where there's little or no bound component data, or the evidence that a centre can provide, or the centre itself has been problematic enough in the past, and perhaps that interacts with the level of evidence they can provide. If these are of insufficient quality and robustness, you may determine that this falls below the minimum evidential threshold. So this is your decision to make. Okay, next slide, please. So, worth reiterating a few things here. In many cases, we don't need a PhD in statistics to QA outcomes. If you're already using advanced statistical models to sort of study your qualifications, then go ahead, use them. But in many cases, we can probably rely on not too complicated an approach to either calculating or QAing. Your past data is your best guide, really, to the whole process, particularly around QAing. You are the best placed people to know how your qualifications work and what the evidence is that you can gather and how much you trust it. And those considerations will hopefully lead you towards the best approach. We have sent out a pro forma, I think we sent it out through the portal, which is there to sort of help record your process that you plan to follow. But the way it's structured will hopefully help with your thinking in terms of presenting the various considerations and prompting you to kind of support and justify some of the decisions you take. So yeah, please do sort of look at the pro forma and hopefully that will help to structure this a little bit better. And we can obviously provide some support where input is needed, and there may be future webinars like this one, and we will be putting out guidance in the future to sort of help further guide thinking. I think that's it. I think we might be at the end. Rebecca? Yes.
Thanks so much, Steve and Zeke. That was really helpful, and I know that there's a lot of questions coming through for a bit of clarity on particular points as well. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Sian to work with you two on answering some of those questions, if that's okay, Sian.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
It's quite quiet, Sian, but we can.
Yes.
See if I can. Is that any better?
Still quite quiet.
Still quiet. I don't think I'm going to be able to make it any louder. Sorry.
That sounds better already, Sian. Actually.
Oh, does it? Okay, a bit more forceful then. So a question has come through from somebody relating to delivery. I think possibly for Stephen. What if the person who directly delivered to students is no longer available because they've changed jobs or something worse? What would you require them to do in relation to this evidence?
Yeah, that's a really hard question, isn't it? I mean, we have sort of largely stated that the judgment of centre assessed grades should come from the teacher who delivered the course and knows those students. And I realise that there may well be, yeah, it may not be that rare that the teacher is no longer, or the trainer is no longer available. Yes, I'm not sure quite what the answer would be there, other than a case of, you can imagine, there might be a scenario where the centre is actually holds a load of quite robust evidence. The question then becomes whether another one of the teachers who didn't take the class has access to that evidence. But you know, you can imagine a scenario where there might be a load of internal assessment that perhaps hasn't been verified or moderated, but is complete and entire and was sort of completed before the March 20th cutoff. And so that might, in that instance, it might be reasonable to, if the centre can access that, that would be reasonably trusted evidence, I think.
Just to add to that, to reiterate but on the one hand, the principle that it should be the teacher that taught the class that provides it, but on the other hand, as Steve said, I think going back to the centre and asking them why they think, whether they think that the information they've provided is essentially equally applicable and reliable, and why, you know, might help you in the end, allow you to make a decision on whether that information is usable or not.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. I've got another one here around qualifications. So from Tamsi, you've asked, saying that your qualifications enable a variety of subjects to be taught or assessed within them. How can we make assumptions about how a learner might have done in one unit if they haven't completed and have never been taught that particular unit? So I think you answered that almost at the very end, Stephen, didn't you, to say you might need to consider whether or not to adapt or to delay, if that was the case?
Yeah, that's right. If you have a unit which is entirely different, and there is not a strong historic relationship, I think it's fair enough to say that you don't have sufficient confidence in any data that would allow you to make any kind of calculation in those instances. And if the learners haven't actually undergone any of the learning, it's kind of almost your decision as to whether that would potentially not invalidate their sort of qualification, but whether, you know, that there would be consequences for saying someone has achieved when they actually don't have that learning. So yeah, I think that there will be cases where adaptation or delay may need to be looked at. Sorry, that's not really super clear, but
No, that's helpful. Thank you, Stephen. Another question around grade boundaries. Do AOs have to provide a grade boundary result based on a learner's previous results and not simply provide a fail? Wouldn't that then require an AO to more complex statistical formulae than before?
sorry, I only partially heard that one.
Sorry. Do AOs have to provide a grade boundary result based on a learner's previous results and not simply provide a pass or fail result? If so, doesn't that require an AO to use more complex statistical formulae?
I mean, what's required of this process is to produce a grade, or if a qualification isn't graded, it's just pass fail. It's just to provide that final outcome. So it's only if your qualification is designed in such a way that you combine marks from units well, if you're combining marks from units rather than combining grades, that you need to worry about grade boundaries. But largely, the outcome of this process just needs to be those final qualification grades for each candidate.
Okay, thank you.
Is that
I think so, thank you. Do we have any, does Ofqual have any view on what adequate entry numbers might be in relation to how much variance might be expected within any qualification? So what is the minimum number of entries that you consider adequate?
Yeah. I think that this actually goes back to that point about looking at your prior year's data. So, you know, we might be sort of thinking, oh, only 50 entrants on this qualification per year. What is a reasonable tolerance? Probably the only answer to that comes from looking at your awarding data in previous years and seeing how much that changes. You know, if the pass rate is changing by 10% every year, then that's obviously that would be a reasonable change from last year to this year's predicted calculated results. Yeah, obviously those kind of mark distributions that we showed, they will get very noisy and distorted, and they won't be a clean bell curve when you have very small numbers. But they're still relatively diagnostic, I think, even if you only have 50 entries. There is no hard and fast rule around numbers. I think it very much comes down to looking at your own past data and getting a feel for what is typical year on year.
Yeah, I'd reiterate that. Completely agree. I think you know that there is no hard and fast rule, but the extent of variability at different levels of centre entry based on previous years might be a helpful guide. But by the time you get to 50, you might start seeing some kind of levels of consistency that and maybe below that in some instances as well.
Okay, thanks both. A question here about calculated grades. Can calculated grades be based purely on the AO pass data on units and qualifications without any centre assessment grade, or does it need to be a combination of both?
No, I think it's perfectly okay if you've got lots of banked unit data, which is quite a good predictor of the missing units. There's no need to go back to the centres. I think that we've said that there can be 100% pure AO calculation, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, obviously, check your outcomes at the end that it looks reasonable, but it should. But yeah, that's perfectly okay. No need to go to centres at all if you've got robust evidence in-house.
I think this again is another question for Steve. Does the trusted evidence have to demonstrate progress towards the assessment requirements of the component, or does it just have to demonstrate achievements of all assessment criteria required to achieve that unit?
This is a really hard question, actually, isn't it? And I think that we've grappled that. I think there's the principle. I believe this is what we have been saying, is that it's a case of if that student had the learning that they've missed, would they have been expected to certificate, then would they have achieved a particular grade? So there may be cases where there is no or limited evidence that they actually have the particular skills or knowledge required, but it's a case of would they have been expected to acquire that? However, there are still the considerations if your qualification does lead towards some kind of competency measure, there will be cases where it's essential to have evidence that the candidate has those particular skills. And in those instances, then you would have to fall towards the adapt or delay. So I think it's very much about the purpose of the qualification and kind of how vital it is to see evidence of particular skills, whereas there will be other cases where the candidate we make have the belief and make the assumption that they would have acquired the knowledge and skills if they carried on being taught, and that it is therefore okay to award it, and that may have consequences for their further stages of learning. But yeah, I don't think we specifically require to see, in all cases, to see evidence of particular competences or skills.
Yeah, I think it's as you say, it's largely we are talking about, as it says in the documentation, where we expect they would have been, and as Steve said, that the exceptions here are going to be when we're talking about qualifications that are more related to occupational jobs and so on, but those aren't really the ones that that this talk was designed to cover. Most of the time when we're talking about centre assessment grades, where we're not talking about those, we're talking about more academic style qualifications rather than occupational ones.
That was really helpful. Thanks both. Thanks, Steve. I think a number of the other questions that people have asked are related to policy. And as we don't have a policy person on the call, I know I can't answer some of them. And so I think it's probably best if we come back to people with answers where possible separately. I think that probably makes more sense than trying to make things up on the hoof or trying to remember where things are in which policy document. So I think that's probably the best thing. There are a number of questions, whether that's around centre assessment grades and malpractice, or if they haven't yet received the right results and appeals, etc., that just mean that they're things that I think policy colleagues would be best placed to answer at this stage. So I shall take those away.
Right. And just to correct one thing I just said, sorry, when I said academics, I really what I was referring to there was qualifications that are designed for progression to further learning rather than, or at least partially to further learning rather than specifically for immediate occupational roles. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sieg, and thanks, Steve, Sieg, and Shan for arranging the session today from your side and for answering so many questions as well. What we'll do after this webinar is concluded is to get those questions over to Ofqual, so Shan, Zeke, and Steve can share them with colleagues and get the answers to the ones that sit outside of that immediate team. I just wanted to let you know as well that straight after the webinar, we'll get these slides emailed out to you. And we're hoping in 24 hours or so, we'll get a video of this webinar up as well, if it's useful for you to, to share with colleagues back in the office. I think that's everything. We're a little bit ahead of time, but I know everyone's very busy at the moment, so it's perhaps not the worst thing in the world to finish early. If you do want to get any further questions in, these are going to go to Ofqual straight after the webinar, so please drop any questions in that you have. And I'm hoping to work with colleagues at Ofqual over the next few weeks to put on further workshop sessions like this. So it'd be really handy if you could let me know, what you think will be particularly useful for your organisation. I'm aware that there's a number of questions around how we do calculation for those qualifications that don't look like sort of GQs like qualifications, you know, things perhaps that aren't the sort of performance table quals. How do we deal with those? So that's an area that we'll look at for some future training. And also we're thinking about adaptation as well. So if you do get any ideas into me, if they pop in your head after the webinar, my email is rebecca.conway@awarding.org.uk. So I think the final thing to say is thanks again to Steve, Zeke and Sean for helping to answer so many questions today. And we look forward to all working together, you know, in the coming weeks and months as we do more work to deal with these extraordinary arrangements. So have a great afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today.